So there's very few people in the universe that I would start a podcast asking this question. But since I have you here, I thought I would start the podcast with this question. What is the ego?
What is that I do?
What is the ego?
What is the ego? I was trained as a psychoanalyst, and the Freud's definition was that the ego is our capacity to perceive accurately reality around us, material reality, and find the appropriate way of responding to it. And that created in psychology a major concern of having a strong ego and not do anything that would kind of, shake up the ego. And this was in conflict with what you hear in the spiritual world, where the ego is always bad for you, whether it's strong or weak. And so...
you had the term a healthy ego, like that was what you wanted. I want a healthy, strong ego. That was the old idea.
The idea it's bad for you, whether it's strong or weak. You want to get rid of it. It's in the way of your spiritual development. So now the way the ego appears in the context of consciousness research, particularly the psychedelic research that I have done, it's something that's forged, among others, the experience of birth. When we go through the birth canal, and it sort of gives us a sense of being separate from everything. It's kind of imprinting, forging, sense of separate identity. And also the experience of that confinement, when the environment is hostile, it gives us a feeling that we should be strong and should be sort of in control and should be, dealing with the world from a powerful, solid place. And then, of course, in the psychedelics, you experience ego death. So there's tremendous fear in professional circles because they have the definition of Freud, the idea that if you lose the ego, you'll
be weakened.
You will not be able to handle everyday reality. You will not have the accurate perception and the ability to respond adequately. Now,
before you continue, do you mind moving the microphone a little bit away from your chin, because I think we're getting the sound. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Yeah.
So what is it that dies in the process of death rebirth? It's really a false ego, something that...
the false self.
Yeah, that's something that Gurdjieff called Kunda buffer and so on. When you lose that ego, it doesn't impair in any way your ability to function in the world. Like suddenly you won't be able to tie your shoelaces, or buy your hamburger or whatever. What it really means, it peels off this false ego, which is your sense of identity and being in the world, the way it was experienced in the birth canal, forcing the sense of very clear separation between you and the external world, and the external world is potentially dangerous for you.
So the ego in that regard was perhaps an attempt to try and gain control over something that felt out of your control.
So, and of course, if you experience that ego death, you'll find out that all that you've left is now to use Karl Marx, you use the manacles, you make the restrictions and the limitations. You'll be much, much freer in the world without losing the capacity to relate to material reality. And in some way you will also be able to function better because you will have more emotional freedom. So that's... something that could be described by a story by Franz Kafka, which is called The Barrow. It's a story about something like a mole who digs under the ground and then expands it and has a little home there. And is sitting there for a while and says, great, I have a home. And then this paranoid idea comes and says, there could be an enemy. He gets here, I'm cornered. I have to make an emergency exit. And then goes back and for a while feels comfortable. And then another idea says, there can be two of them. So to live with this kind of an ego in the world you try to do things to be safe, for security and so on. And we do it on a global scale. Like when there was the danger of atomic war between United States and,
the collective ego
producing enough of the rockets of the
more than enough rockets to obliterate everything.
We are so concerned about being safe that we create a very unsafe world. I think it's estimated if 2% of the nuclear arsenal were exploded, it would be over for everybody. But
the classic mole.
Yeah, there was some of it was expressed actually in funny sexual language. There was some discussion about the Russians and the Americans, and an American general says, we have to harden our missiles. The Russians are a little harder than we are. So they were counting the missiles and be sure that they have more, so that fear, the irrational fear, suddenly leads to behavior that actually is dangerous.
Yeah, that makes sense.
People also act that way frequently in everyday life, because they feel threatened by something that is not out there, that is a projection of this fear. So if you can get rid of that ego, you feel that you're more part of the world. Mm-hmm. The boundaries, the separation is not that firm,
I think in my own, personal practice, and I think one of the key elements of getting rid of the ego is also recognizing what is left when you do. And that's, your true self, which is your consciousness, is the term that I like to call it, in my own language, that sense of being, the observer of the ego, that force that's animating life, to quote what Don Miguel Ruiz would describe it as, rather than, the manifestations of the mind, and to really become in touch with that and realize that that's what you are. So many of your problems start to fade away. All of these fires that you thought you had to put out, all of a sudden when you recognize your true self, you can just let them die out on their own. You don't need to go call all the fire trucks and put them out, because they're not really real. They're not part of who you truly are. And I think that's been a big part of the Buddhist teaching, but somehow, and many other spiritual traditions at the core, but somehow we lost the way. How did we lose the way so badly when we had this wisdom at some point, or at least some people had it, and then we kind of lost it collectively?
Well, I think what happened during the scientific industrial revolution, particularly in England and then France, that major inventions were made, technological inventions, like starting with the steam machine and so on. And then they were converted into inventions, technological inventions that started changing the world. Suddenly they were, railroads and things like that, and trains, and all kinds of mechanical gadgets. And what it created was a kind of intoxication that led to a hubris. We are rational people. For example, for several years, the Notre Dame in Paris was renamed the Temple of Reason. And so suddenly it was reason, that was important. And everything that was not rational was seen as irrational, and as that kind of a leftover of the dark ages, of the childhood of humanity. There was a kind of a very sort of a dismissive attitude towards the native cultures. They were the primitive, they were the savages. We are now the mature sort of rational beings.
Well, now, it seems that also there was some reason for that, in that a lot of the metaphysical and spiritual traditions were entwined with poisonous beliefs.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know how to extract the tumor from the organism.
Very much so, yeah. But you see, what happened also, that not everything that's not rational is irrational. The mystics are not necessarily irrational. The mystics have experienced dimensions of reality that are normally not available to our physical senses. And they had to incorporate it into their worldview. So they still were able to function, they still could function in everyday life, but they suddenly had certain information showing that the vast dimensions that are not available to senses, yet extremely important. So it was something like what happened at the end of the 15th century, where Columbus, the people started coming and telling these worlds that are out there and bringing new spices and so on. People had to expand their worldview. Suddenly there was a new information coming. So this is what the mystics were in. The mystics discovered that there is more to existence than what meets the eye, what you experience in everyday life. So the baby was kind of thrown out of the bathwater, and all these things were seen as as primitive or as even pathologized. And now, since maybe the mid of the 20th century, we started very sort of laboriously sorting out, trying to recover the healthy things that were involved, like what was happening in shamanic rituals, what was happening in the rites of passage, and what was happening in the mysteries, and so on. That this was not just sort of hocus pocus, some kind of woo-woo stuff, magical, irrational thinking, but that it was really relating to some very important dimensions of human personality and also the universal scheme of things.
Yeah. And when you say what we started to do in the middle of that century, for a lot of people will just say we as the collective, but you actually mean you as part of that, because you were one of these forces that was paddling the boat, that was recovering the good pieces and building back rituals and creating new rituals that could help guide people back to the healthy parts of these metaphysics.
I was part of a small group of people who formulated the principles of transpersonal psychology with Abe Maslow and Tony Sutich and Jim Fadiman, for example, where Tony Sutich and Abe Maslow had started Humanistic Psychology in the 50s as a reaction to two schools that dominated somehow the academic circles, which was Freudian analysis and behaviorism. They started seeing the limitations. Trying to understand humans by studying rats and pigeons didn't suddenly make sense, or trying to create human psychology by specifically focusing on populations of psychiatric patients, the way it was done in psychoanalysis. So they discovered this new psychology called humanistic, which was, unlike behaviorism, they were also honoring the introspection. Behaviorists didn't want to hear anything about consciousness. They wanted to just sort of observe behavior. There's a joke, I don't know if I can mention it here. But
you can, for sure.
There's a joke that transpersonal psychologists make about behaviorists. And it's about a couple who are both behaviorists and they make love in the bedroom. And when it's over, he looks at her and says, "It was fantastic for you. How was it for me?" So anyway, so humanistic psychology brought again back importance of introspection, consciousness, and also focusing not just on a population of psychiatric patients, but not only so-called normal people, but what Maslow called the growing tip of population. People who had some extraordinary capacities. And he actually studied people who had spontaneous mystical experiences. He called it peak experiences. Mm-hmm. And he started sort of arguing, with mainstream psychiatry, these are not manifestations of mental disease. He didn't find any indications of psychiatric illness in these people. And he found out that if these experiences are properly integrated, they actually are conducive to what he called self-actualization, self-realization, enhancement of creativity, and developing your full human potential. Okay.
Yeah.
And humanistic psychology became very popular and was creating conferences which were well attended by professionals as well as the lay population. And so Maslow and Tony Sutich could have been very satisfied, but they were not, because they realized they left out something very important, which was anything related to spirituality. Not even humanistic psychology had that. They didn't. There was no way of relating from that perspective to spiritual practice, to meditation, even to things like love or creativity.
And those are the pathways to be able to duplicate these peak experiences. Yeah. If you just wait, sitting around hoping, that this will happen, it's like going somewhere and hoping a tornado hits, like maybe it will. Yeah. But if you're a storm chaser, you better, look for the conditions and create the conditions that are going to put you in the most favorable place. Yeah. And that's really, I think, where you kind of came in and said, all right, these peak experiences can lead to transcendent self-actualization. Let's try and figure out how we get there. Right?
So we had meetings, and we were brainstorming this, and we finally ended up with psychology, which we felt made a lot of sense, because it was not making psychotics of every founder of religion or a prophet or fun of the apostles or followers and so on, or shamans. It treated with respect the ritual and spiritual history of humanity, and it was also integrating the observations from consciousness research. And this is where I came in. I was invited by Maslow to bring in the observations from psychedelic research. And so initially they wanted to call it transhumanistic psychology. And then I wrote a paper which was called Varieties of Transpersonal Experiences. And then they liked the term, so they started calling it transpersonal psychology. And so for a while we felt really this psychology made sense. But we could not find ways of linking it to what we knew as science, as the, hard science, because it was in such conflict with what Fritjof Capra, the physicist, called Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm, monistic materialistic science. And we didn't know what to do with it. And then Fritjof Capra actually published the book, The Tao of Physics, where he showed that the worldview that was emerging from quantum relativistic physics was rapidly converging with the worldview of the great spiritual philosophies of the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. He published the book, The Tao of Physics, which had on the cover pictures of the particles created in collisions, the linear accelerator, and over it he had a dancing Shiva, Nataraja. Science coming together with spirituality. And so his book came out, and Frances Vaughan, one of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology, invited Fritjof to her home to meet a group of us, transpersonal psychologists, and we listened to it, and I immediately knew what the problem is. We were trying to link this new psychology, transpersonal psychology, to a 17th century philosophy, the Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm, which was linked with monistic materialistic philosophy, which wasn't the philosophy of either Newton or Descartes. This was like implanted, grafted on that, And so Fritjof and I kind of hit it off, and we started doing seminars, which were called Journeys Beyond Space and Time.
Sounds about right.
Fritjof would take the morning and told the participants what modern physicists think about matter, the world of matter, And that since the time of the discovery of radioactivity and X-rays, how the concept of matter was changing from the Newtonian atoms, which were indivisible. Atom means something that cannot be cut any further. Temnein is to cut. Atom means you cannot cut it any further. But they found out that the X-rays went through the atoms. So they were not these billiard balls. They were really empty. And Fritjof talked about how much stuff, matter, physics lost just from going from the idea of the atom as being solid to what was called a planetary model, where there was a nucleus in the middle and then the electrons whirling at a very fast speed. And he says, if you imagine an atom blown to the size of a cathedral, the size of the nucleus would be like a pinhead in the middle of the cathedral, and the electrons would be like specks of dust sort of whirling where the walls are, and the inside of the cathedral is how much matter physics lost just in this first step from the solid atom to the planetary model. And then he said, but of course it turned out that even the nucleus was not solid. There were then protons and neutrons. And then it turned into like several hundred of subatomic particles all the way down to quarks.
Yeah.
And so they found out that matter was essentially empty on the subatomic level. You couldn't even say whether something was there. There were just probability that is there, or probability where it's located. And so what was left then was more related to consciousness, had to do with patterns, with mathematical equations and so on. And so this was quite exciting. And then Fritjof continued, talking. The whole universe is really a vibratory system. There are no objects, there are only fields and kind of condensation of fields. David Bohm said we shouldn't be even using nouns because everything is a process. I mentioned, this morning I would be Stan Grofing, and this would be Oaklanding.
Yeah. It's true, though, that fallacy of something being stable and eternal is just something we used as a symbol.
And then he talked about the theories of the beginning of the universe. 13.8 billion years ago, there was this dimensionless point, singularity, and there was explosion and Big Bang. And that's where time and space were created out of nothing. And all the matter that now creates billions of galaxies was pouring out of that singularity. Yeah,
nothing or everything, depending on...
Then he talked about, black holes, white holes, wormholes, and so on. So we took lunch, and then we came after lunch. People's minds were completely blown. What Fritjof had said. So when I came with my psychedelic stuff, it sounded pretty much down to earth, easy.
That was the easy stuff.
Like maybe past lives, and you're living your birth, and psycho-spiritual death, rebirth, and so on. And I was talking about what can happen in certain special states of mind.
And
but
you
had
how many?
Was describing the reality, the material reality that we live in.
I heard in this morning's introduction of you actually that you'd worked with like 10,000 different people with at that point. Is that number accurate from what I heard? That there's that was your data set?
Over 4,000 people in psychedelic sessions where I was present personally, and then I counted between close to 45,000 people that I have seen in holotropic breathwork sessions. But we also do big groups. I mean, I was just there when they were having the experiences, but then the processing is done in small groups. So I didn't hear the stories of all of them. These were the facilitators that were helping, but I was there, when 45,000 people had the holotropic breathwork experience.
It seems to me that there's no psychiatrist that has that amount of data on people experiencing peak experiences. I mean, that has to place you as singularly, the bearer of as much knowledge on that field between the breath work, which creates these, these altered states, these peak experiences, as well, of course, as the LSD and the other entheogens that you might have worked with. I mean, that amount of data places you as a pretty unique authority on that state.
Yeah, at least when you are talking about upfront, legal research. I mean, there were people who were doing underground work for 40 years when it was forbidden to do it officially.
Yeah.
So there must be people who have seen, at least that number.
I'd love to meet them. That would be amazing.
But not something that generated information that was made available, to the world, to the academic world.
And through that process, you developed an understanding of what you called the basic prenatal matrices, these different forces that you deal with during the birth process that kind of shape and color your life until you kind of address those situations and kind of integrate them and move forward. And I was hoping you could kind of explain roughly that theorem.
Yes, well, I came into this work equipped with my medical training. I would say pretty biased, because I studied medicine at the time when we had a Marxist regime. We were controlled by the Soviet Union, so we got really the purest materialistic doctrine. Everything that was considered to be idealistic was either ridiculed or it was censored out. And then I had psychoanalytic training, 7 years of personal training analysis, which started up front legally, but then we had to go underground because Freud was unacceptable for the communists. So it was just a private arrangement between me and my analyst. But those were the two things that I had: medical training and psychoanalytic training. Mm-hmm. And then I was not quite satisfied with psychoanalysis. Initially not the theory of psychoanalysis, but the practice. I realized how long it takes, how much time, energy, money, and I knew that the results were not exactly breathtaking.
Yeah. Talking
I was there 7 years, and if you say, did it change you? I would say, well, I changed. 7 years is a long time.
You were Stan Grofing.
People change anything. Anyway, so that was when I volunteered for a psychedelic session, and that just completely changed the direction where I was going. I said, I was so excited about these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and said to them, already a psychiatrist, so the best thing I can do is to study these non-ordinary states. So if you look at my professional career, I have done very little professionally that would not be in one way or another related to these non-ordinary states. And actually, not all non-ordinary states, but I focused on a special large subcategory which have healing, transformative, and evolutionary potential. Experiences of shamans in initiatory crisis, or experiences of the initiates in the rites of passage, or the experiences of the initiates in the mysteries of death and rebirth in antiquity, or the kinds of experiences that are induced by various forms of what I call technology of the sacred, different forms of yoga, different schools of Buddhism, from Theravada to Zen and Vajrayana, the experiences of the Sufis induced by chanting, breathing, or the whirling dervishes, Kabbalistic experiences, and so on. And of course, experiences induced by psychedelics. So
is that
it became my kind of, I say, vocation, profession, and passion, for my life. Yeah.
And we're all grateful for it. Would you say that for when you were developing the holotropic breathing method, did you draw on the yogic tradition? Was that where you got the idea, the kind of Kundalini practices that were in its own way hyperoxygenating, or where did that come from?
I'll try to be as brief as I can be for this, but it goes back to the work with psychedelics, where initially what happened that when we took psychedelics or gave psychedelics, that sometimes the result was great. It's very much like in Hofmann's first, Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD by accidental intoxication. He had a very challenging session, but he ended up with a feeling of rebirth and the feeling that many of his problems were washed away, and this was the beginning of a new period in his life. Now, this was not always that way. Sometimes we opened up something new that didn't get finished, or sometimes the symptoms got accentuated. And initially we didn't think that we can do anything about it. You just have to schedule another session and hope that it's going to be a better result. And then it happened a couple of times that my patients were coming down from the session. The drug was already wearing off, and they didn't feel comfortable. They felt some kind of difficult emotions or difficult physical feelings. The first one was a man who was coming down, the drug was wearing off, and he felt really full of rage. Mm-hmm. And then had a pain in the shoulder and was kind of hitting this shoulder and say, if I could get through this pain in the shoulder. I think I would feel better. And he said, would you put some pressure there? So I would go and put some pressure. And he says, not enough, more. Not enough, more. My thumb was already breaking. And so I keep pushing. And then he started growling and started making faces and started coughing and shaking. And we were doing it for some time, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour most. And he felt totally relaxed and a wonderful place. And another time I came to the patient. She was coming down. The drug was wearing off. And she felt terribly nauseated and some kind of pain in the belly. And I came and I pushed on it, just trying to find out what it was, like what doctors do, and this incredible projectile vomiting. Couple of episodes of that. And she was great. No nausea, ecstatic. And so I realized that you can do something to help the integration. And so I started doing it systematically. When somebody was coming down, I would say, how are you feeling? What's happening in your body? And so on. And then do you want to do some body work if there was a problem?
Yeah.
And so I started doing it systematically. And then it happened several times that as I was doing this body work, which I basically, discovered by following the instructions of my patients, some of the patients started breathing fast. What's called saccadic breathing. And then they told me that the fast breathing took them back into the session. The drug was already wearing off, but they were like having a full-blown psychedelic experience. So I realized that you can do something with your breathing to bring out unconscious material. And then there was a situation where I had already done a lot of the research, and it was becoming more and more complicated. We couldn't get funds and permissions for it. And I had so much material that I wanted to put it down, write it down. And I got invitations from several publishers, because at that time we were the last group that was doing official research, and LSD was making headlines. It was very, very interesting subject. So they said, do you write a book? And so I made a contract with Viking Press for 2 books. And I wanted to take a sabbatical. And Michael Murphy, the co-founder of SLN, met me in a party and said, what are you doing these days? I said, taking a sabbatical, write a couple of books. He said, why don't you come to Esalen? Esalen is a beautiful place to write books. We're going to give you a house on the ocean. There are beautiful hot springs there. These are all, sacred Indian grounds. It's Big Sur in California, on the coast between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so I accepted that. And the deal was that I was doing a certain number of workshops for SLN and trading it for room and board. It's a great. Big Sur is beautiful. There are sort of whales going by twice a year, and there are seals and otters playing.
Idyllic.
And monarch butterflies sort of flying by and ending up on the trees. So it was great. And I was talking in the workshops about the research that we did, what kind of experiences people had, what kind of impact it had on them, and so on. And people were not very happy with me. They said, well, it's great to hear about all these fantastic experiences, but can't we do something? Don't you have a little stash somewhere on the side? And I said, well, I don't think people in SLN would be very happy, I don't have legal access to psychedelics. And then I started thinking, what can we do? And I remembered these things, that breathing can do something. And so we started sort of playing with that, and we found out that people can have powerful experiences. Christina, my late wife, she was a yoga teacher. And so she brings some of the exercises, the preparation into it, and so on. But there was this element of yoga, but so not inspiration for the breathwork was not coming from yoga. This was coming from this psychedelic work. And then something major happened. We were initially working in a strange way. We asked people to lie down with their heads towards the center. We were playing the music like we played in psychedelic sessions. And people were holding hands and doing faster breathing. And there were always some people who were very close to some unconscious material, so that it triggered them. And then we stopped working with the group, and we worked with the people, 1 or 2 people who started going through something, and the other people were watching. But sometimes it happens that just watching somebody reliving birth triggered other people. So sometimes we ended up with 3 people going on. And I was working with one person, Christina with another, and then the people in the group were sort of taking care of somebody else who needed just the support, waiting for us to come there and do some body work. And
you said that, so you found overwhelmingly that what people were experiencing in that breath work was some element of the birth process.
That was very common, yes.
Yeah, so that was just a common ground that you saw.
But those were the major breakthroughs. I think I came equipped with psychoanalysis and medicine. And according to psychiatry, there wasn't supposed to be anything in the psyche that was not part of postnatal biography. Freud said the newborn is a tabula rasa. There's nothing that precedes birth, including birth itself. That doesn't somehow count. And then, the first major breakthrough for me, I see people going through birth. And then I took a high dose myself, and I went through birth. So then I was dealing, like a freshly baked psychiatrist with the opinion of the authorities who were telling me that it's not possible to experience birth. There's no memory because the cortex is not what's called myelinized. The neurons don't have the protective fatty sheets that are they considered to be necessary for creating memory. And then when it happened again and again to me and other people, I said, well, it's obviously a clinical fact. It's up to the physiologist to explain where it's recorded, if it cannot be recorded in the cortex. Maybe it's in subcortex. Maybe it's in the spinal cord. Maybe it's in every cell of the body. Because in biology, they teach you there is also protoplasmatic memory. Every cell has a certain capacity of creating primitive memory. And so, and so then I incorporated this breath work into this breath work, the perinatal level, the experience of birth and prenatal. And then a major challenge came when people started having other experiences, like experiencing something from other centuries, sometimes with the same of personal remembering, when it was like this happened to in my previous lifetime. And then they started seeing mythological images from the collective unconscious. And so it was a major conceptual struggle to accept the possibility, that we can have a record of something that happened before we were born. And before we were conceived. Right.
And it's a question that some of the Eastern traditions that believe in reincarnation have less of a hard time with. It's just in that Western model that developed where you have to have that concrete.
On the one hand, they have methods. If you are involved in some kind of intense meditation, those experiences can happen. And they also had the experiences in India. The number of young children between the age of 3 and 5 start talking about previous lifetimes. There's actually a researcher, Ian Stevenson, from the University of Virginia, who studied over 3,000 children who, between the age of 3 and 5, claimed that they remembered their past life. They gave names and places. And in many instances, he actually identified the village or the town and took the child there. And the child knew the topography and knew names of the people. Or that Sharmot Parma was one of the famous cases, claimed that he was a businessman selling cookies and soda water. And they found a shop. He knew the names of the people. He recognized some changes that they made with the furniture in the shop. And then they wanted to create a test, so they created a malfunction of the machine that made the soda water, and the little kid came and was able to fix it. Okay. So those are amazing case stories.
Why are we so hesitant to, even with evidence like that? Why are we so hesitant as a culture to, believe in something like reincarnation? Just the stubbornness of that.
Today, I find it very, very difficult to understand, because as if everything was clear and understandable. Like, why does anything exist at all? Where does that come from? Why not nothingness? Why something exists? Where does consciousness come from? And the existence, a lot about existence is a kind of miraculous.
Yeah,
it's not all understandable with simple reason. Down earth, everything that cannot be related to circumcision or toilet training.
Yeah,
you see so many miraculous things. In the world,
Especially if you're involved in psychedelic medicine, then that seems to.
I don't know why we like everything to be explained in such a pedestrian, uninteresting way.
Maybe it is just that the remnants of having to throw out the superstitions and the harmful parts. It's just that was a defense mechanism. Let's just get rid of it all.
Show that you're sane and rational.
Yeah, and that person. And all
nonsense,
of the yeah, and I think we're finally transcending that era, which is must be a beautiful thing for you to see when the collective consciousness in mass is becoming aware of both science and metaphysics blending in a really beautiful way.
If you are scientifically trained in the Western way, everything seems to be chains of causes and effects. Everything that happens has some cause and causes something else. And we seem to be able to deal with it quite well until we go to the beginning. What is the cause of causes? Then nobody wants to go there very much.
That's the realm of metaphysics at that point.
And Terence McKenna was great about it. He said, give me one miracle and I explain everything else. Where the universe came from, and then everything is cause and effect. But I didn't complete that story of the holotropic breathwork. So we were doing this, and then with the circle and the music and so on. And then one day we had a workshop coming, which had 46 people, and people come to Asylum from all over the world, like South America, Europe, Australia, and so on. And I was working in the garden. I was lifting a beam, and I threw off my back, and it was like having a dagger sort of in my back. Now, if you do body work with people, you get all the concussions and so on. I couldn't imagine sort of coming close to anybody and do something with my back. And so we were saying, what are we going to do with them? We had 46 people. We promised, breathwork, working with breathwork and music. And then we finally said, we'll let them breathe with each other. We'll pair them up, and we just explain what they would do, what we see, press on this place and that place, and we'll just supervise this. And so we did it, and this was such a success that we never did it differently. Not only had, most of the people had experiences in the group, but the sitters were excited. They said, what a privilege it is to be there in such an intimate situation with the process of another person, and how much they learned from the process of from others. And that they started feeling they actually would like to become facilitators and do this kind of work with others.
Yeah.
So that was the final four. Now we work in pairs always, and it was music. And then the major changes then where we went to anthropological archives, where anthropologists collected the trance-inducing music from all over the world. Many cultures developed drumming rhythms that if you study it in the laboratory, they have the power to change the synchronization, desynchronization in the brain waves and so on. So they have very, very powerful effect on the brain waves and create a trance state. So we were then using, from African tribes, Balinese music and the bhajans and kirtans, the chants of the Hindus, or some Tibetan ritual music and so on, in combination with the breathing, but people being paired up. So everybody has his personal assistant, so to say, and then several of the people who went through the training, they are there for the whole group to deal with some of the situations that untrained people would have difficulties handling.
Yeah, in my experience, it seems what the process that I've gone through was almost like the earlier stages of what you were doing, where there's the facilitators that mostly do the work and everybody breathes at the same time. But, of course, getting to similar spots, emotional catharsis, moments of clarity, even visionary states that have been extremely powerful. And, people discredit that. I remember my fiance, who's actually right here in the room, we go to a retreat where we were going to do breath work. And she's looking at me like, breath work? Come on. Because we've done psychedelics together. Like, this is going to be nothing. I'm just going to go. Maybe I'll fall asleep. She thought she might fall asleep. She didn't know what was going to happen. And we go through and, I'd done it once before. I knew how powerful it was. And then seeing that incredible emotional release where just tears of years of repressed feelings came flooding out, and a lightness that comes on the other side of that. I mean, it can be as potent as any medicine that you ingest. And it's right here. It's like this diamond that we have, all we have to do is look for it, almost like a quantum physics thing. Like you look for it, you observe it, and you find it. You look inside your breath and find this thing. And then you have this diamond that you can use, as a sacred power stone that you have with you at any given point.
Yeah. Actually, this was a very unique opportunity for us because we did the pre-conference workshop with the Holotropic Breathwork, and this is a psychedelic conference, so there's enormous number of people who had personal experiences. And so we heard in the sharing groups when people were comparing that also the same as you are saying, they didn't expect very much because they had experiences with psychedelics, and they were quite impressed.
I've done ayahuasca. This is just breath.
How much you can actually do.
Yeah.
And I'm still surprised something with all the experience, the intensity of the experience that you sometimes see when I have some suspicion that maybe that person, Stan Grof worked with psychedelics, so let's slip something and he's going to handle it, And then when 2 hours later they're fine and they're talking about their experiences, I know it couldn't have been LSD,
So let me see, one of the other methods for creating peak experience, which I was exposed to and learned, was ecstatic dance, which is basically the utilization of music and movement to create a similar kind of trance state where you can escape the egoic self and access that force of consciousness by allowing just your body and the music to take over your somatic processing to a certain degree. And I really took to that. I've always enjoyed movement and dancing, and I took to that, and I applied, as the guide of that practice, which I've now led several groups through, I applied your BPM 1 through 4 model as the journey. It's the hero's journey that we go on through music. So let me see, now that I have you here, let me see if I roughly got it right, and maybe we can make some improvements. So in BPM 1, the person is inside.
Maybe you should say that the concept, the BPM, basic perinatal matrix, those are certain experiential clusters that people link to the 4 consecutive stages of birth. So basic perinatal matrix 1, 2, 3, 4 relates to the stages as the fetus is going through biological birth.
Things that are loosely everyone experiences at some given point. So there's the experience of being in the womb. All is well. Food is coming effortlessly into your body.
If it's a good pregnancy.
If it's a good pregnancy, for the most part. And at least in the dance, that's how we start. We suppose it's a good pregnancy and everything is moving along quite well. You're swimming in a confined space, but it feels like infinite space because you don't really know the difference. You're in fluid and kind of all is well. And then...
kind of oceanic.
Sure, yeah. And blissful, in its own way. And then BPM 2 is when the water breaks, and that's the all hell breaks loose moment. What the hell is happening to my world? My world is collapsing in on me.
The contractions.
Contractions, chaos, literally apocalypse. The world is coming to an end for all you know. Like, what the hell is this? You've never experienced it before. You've never had a data set of anything close to that. And it's that moment of chaos without knowing at all what to do.
And the cervix is not open, so we are really in a no exit kind of trapped hopeless.
Where Franz Kafka's Mole with no back door. Yeah. And then in BPM 3, the cervix opens and we realize, we got a canal and we got to get through there. And that's where that kind of warrior archetype comes, that desire to fight. And I'm going to make it through this thing. And that the assertion of your will in order to find a better means to make it out of the chaos. And then in BPM 4, the final stage, that gasp of air when you make it out of the birth canal and experience life, this actual first birth, which we experience as a rebirth, but that first birth.
You've got it, Yeah, maybe one little addition was that the third matrix actually is also generates a lot of sexual energy, that the choking somehow creates something that feels very much like sexual arousal. And so people get a lot of sexual imagery and they don't understand how that
Interesting.
But it seems that with pain and choking, the human organism generates a kind of energy that has very much the quality of sexual energy.
Do you think that's related to the endorphin response that's similar, or do you think it's some kind of psychological connection? Because that's very interesting to connect it to that.
Well, I think there's a larger pattern, which is that life threat can activate the sexual drive. Mm-hmm. And this is called in a collective scale. It's called in psychology avant deluge behavior, before flood, before catastrophe. Like when there's some kind of catastrophe coming, the war is coming, or so on, or some, natural disaster.
Some kind of cataclysm,
People tend to throw themselves into promiscuous sexual behavior, and this is seen as a potential compensatory mechanism. There's going to be death, and so nature is trying to sort of generate some reserves,
Maybe that's why all these prophets come up with these doomsday stories. They're just trying to get everybody horny. Yeah. That's the plan. 2012 Mayan apocalypse was just a big pickup line to have more sex with people. It's really interesting, though. I think it clearly seems to make sense. It's interesting how the mind and body are so entwined in so many ways, and we try to keep them separate. We try to say, okay, here's mind over here, here's body over here, here's consciousness over here, when really they're just completely inexorably wrapped, and entwined within each other.
A lot of the abnormal sexual practices can actually be understood from this connection between birth and sex. For example, there are the ischemic sexual practices where people try to choke themselves and then, masturbate or something. Mm-hmm. Like David Carradine, who
died doing that.
Was found, and they thought initially it was suicide because he lost the footing on the stool, but it was really, he was known to do these sexual practices.
Yeah.
Or what is called the bondage syndrome, people who want to be bound and choked as part of a sexual situation, or being hurt or hurting others and so on. If you look at this third matrix, it's a situation where you experience sexual arousal in a situation where you are inflicting pain on another organism, on your mother. Another organism, your mother, is inflicting pain on you. You cannot choke. You cannot breathe. You choke. There is also this other forms of biological material. So all these kinds of things that are described by Krafft-Ebing in what he called psychopathia sexualis, or abnormal sexual practices, can be seen as having the roots sort of in this very strange combination of sexual arousal with vital danger and pain and aggression and so on, anxiety.
That's really interesting. And then further study into it, actually, I was reading some studies that have shown when they measure the brainwave patterns that you can create certain peak experiences by mimicking these, like in these power exchange kind of dominant and submissive sexual practices. The dominant experience is more of a classic flow state where, it's a drop from beta frequency into alpha frequency, and that, sense of timelessness where everything drifts away. And then the submissive will experience transient hypofrontality where, they again lose track of time and pain and space, and everything starts to blur. And those states where you're losing the self tend to be some of the most pleasurable states. So you combine sexual pleasure with a positive brain state, and you have buttons that, people are going to press, when you can press the buttons that feel good. Yeah. Well, this has been a real honor. It's been a pleasure to meet you. As I said in the intro, I grew up in a house where your name was commonplace, and the worldview of things that we were looking at, was shaped by the work that you've done, and of course, both in psychedelics, in breathing, and just in the philosophy and psychology itself. So I honor you, sir, and yes. Thank you for coming on the show. It's a real full circle moment for me.
Wonderful interview. This I've done many of them, as you can imagine, in my life, and the quality of the interview frequently depends on the interviewer. Whether you know the subject, you've had some experiences, you can ask intelligent questions. So this has been great, very, very pleasant, exciting to speak.
Well, thank you so much. That was incredible. Thanks, everybody. Bye.